March 30th, 1981. George Washington University Hospital, Washington, D.C. The bullet had come within an inch of his heart. A .22 caliber Devastator round, designed to explode on impact, had ricocheted off the presidential limousine, slipped through a gap in the open door, and lodged itself in Ronald Reagan's left lung, stopping less than an inch from the aorta. If it had exploded as intended, the 40th President of the United States would have died on the sidewalk outside the Washington Hilton, just 69 days into his presidency. But the bullet had not exploded, and Ronald Reagan, the former actor who had always believed that God had a plan for his life, was still alive. The limousine had rushed him to George Washington University Hospital, where Secret Service agent Jerry Parr had made the split-second decision to divert from the White House when Reagan began coughing up bright red, frothy blood. It was the decision that saved his life. By the time they reached the emergency room, Reagan had lost nearly half his blood volume. His systolic blood pressure had dropped to 60. He was minutes from death, but no one watching would have known it. As the medical team surrounded him, as nurses cut away his $1,000 suit, as doctors prepared for emergency surgery, Ronald Reagan did what he had always done in moments of crisis. He performed. He looked up at the worried faces around him and said, with perfect comic timing, "Please tell me you're all Republicans." Dr. Joseph Giordano, a liberal Democrat who would be leading the surgical team, leaned over the president and replied, "Today, Mr. President, we're all Republicans." Reagan smiled, even as his life hung in the balance. It was the first of many quips that would define this day, the day that Ronald Reagan transformed himself from a politician into a legend. The surgery lasted nearly 3 hours. The bullet was removed, the bleeding stopped, the damaged lung repaired. When Reagan emerged from anesthesia, groggy and intubated, unable to speak, he reached for a pen and paper. The nurses expected him to ask about his condition, about the other victims, about the state of the nation. Instead, he wrote, "I'd like to do this scene again," starting at the hotel. The medical staff laughed, relieved that their patient's famous sense of humor had survived the surgery intact. But Reagan was not finished. Over the next several hours, as he drifted in and out of consciousness, he continued to scribble notes, each one revealing something about the man behind the public persona. "Send me to L.A. where I can see the air I'm breathing," he wrote, a joke about the smog in his adopted hometown. "If I had this much attention in Hollywood, I'd have stayed there," read another note. And then, quoting the comedian W.C. Fields, "All in all, I'd rather be in Philadelphia." The nurses collected these notes, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a man facing death with grace, humor, and an unshakable faith that everything would be all right. Nancy Reagan arrived at the hospital shortly after the shooting, having been informed by Secret Service agents while she was at a luncheon. She had rushed to her husband's side, her face pale with terror, her hands trembling. When she finally saw him, lying in the recovery room with tubes and wires attached to his body, she broke down. Reagan looked up at her, his eyes soft with love, and whispered the first words he spoke after the tube was removed from his throat. "Honey, I forgot to duck." It was a line borrowed from Jack Dempsey, who had said it to his wife after losing the heavyweight championship to Gene Tunney in 1926. Reagan had remembered it from his days as a sports announcer in Des Moines, had filed it away in his actor's memory, and had retrieved it at the perfect moment to reassure his wife that he was still himself, still the man she had married, still able to find humor in the darkest circumstances. Nancy laughed through her tears, clutching his hand. "I love you," she said. "I love you too, honey," Reagan replied. "But I should have zigged when I zagged." Later that evening, when Reagan was more fully conscious, he had a longer conversation with Nancy in the privacy of his hospital room. The Secret Service agent stood outside, the doctors had completed their rounds, and for a few moments, the President of the United States was simply a husband talking to his wife about the day that had nearly taken his life. "I thought I was dying, Nancy," Reagan said quietly, his voice still weak from the surgery. "When I couldn't breathe, when I felt myself getting weaker, I thought this was it. I thought I was going to die right there on the floor of the emergency room." Nancy squeezed his hand tighter. "Don't talk like that. You're alive. You're going to be fine." Reagan shook his head slowly. "No, I need to say this. I need to tell you what I was thinking, what I was feeling, because something happened to me today. Nancy, something changed." He looked at the ceiling, gathering his thoughts. "When I was lying there, when I thought I was dying, I wasn't afraid. I should have been afraid. Any sensible person would have been afraid. But I wasn't. I felt peaceful. I felt like God was with me, like He was telling me that everything was going to be all right, one way or another." Nancy listened in silence, knowing that her husband was sharing something deeply personal, something he might never say to anyone else. "I've always believed in God," Reagan continued. "You know that. I've always believed that there's a plan, that things happen for a reason, that we're not just accidents stumbling through an indifferent universe. But today, I felt it. I didn't just believe it. I felt it. I felt God's presence, His love, His protection." He turned to look at Nancy, his eyes bright with conviction. "I think God saved me today, Nancy. I think He saved me for a reason. I don't know what that reason is yet, but I know there is one. I know that I'm supposed to do something with the time I have left, something important, something that matters." Nancy said softly, "You're already doing something important, Ronnie. You're the president. You're leading the country." Reagan nodded. "Yes, but now it feels different. Now it feels like a mission, not just a job. I've been given a second chance, Nancy. Not everyone gets that, and I don't intend to waste it." He was quiet for a moment, then continued. "I thought about my father today. You know he was a Catholic, even though he wasn't very devout. But he always told me that God has a plan for everyone, that nothing happens by accident. I used to think that was just something people said to make themselves feel better about the bad things that happen. But today, I understood what he meant. Today, I felt the truth of it." Nancy asked, "What are you going to do differently?" Reagan considered the question carefully. "I'm going to work harder for peace. I know that sounds strange, coming from someone who's been called a warmonger and a cowboy, but that's what I kept thinking about lying there on that table. I kept thinking about nuclear weapons, about the missiles pointed at each other, about the millions of people who could die in a flash if something went wrong. I kept thinking that I have to do something about that. I have to find a way to make the world safer." He paused, his expression growing more intense. "The Soviets, Nancy. I've spent my whole political career fighting communism, warning about the Soviet threat, building up our defenses, and I still believe all of that is necessary. But I also believe that we have to find a way to talk to them, to negotiate, to reduce the danger of nuclear war. I can't just be against something. I have to be for something. I have to offer hope, not just fear." Nancy said, "You've always offered hope, Ronnie. That's why people love you." Reagan smiled weakly. "Maybe. But I want to do more. I want to leave the world better than I found it. I want to be remembered as the president who ended the Cold War, not the president who started World War III. And I think I can do it. I think I can find a way to work with the Soviets, to build trust, to reduce the arsenals on both sides. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight, but I believe it's possible. I believe God saved me today so that I could make it happen." He closed his eyes, exhausted by the effort of speaking. Nancy leaned over and kissed his forehead. "Rest now," she said. "You can save the world tomorrow." Reagan chuckled softly. "I'll try, but first, I need to get out of this hospital. I hate hospitals. Always have. The food is terrible and the gowns are drafty." Nancy laughed despite herself. "Even now, you can't stop making jokes." Reagan opened his eyes and looked at her with complete sincerity. "The jokes are how I cope, Nancy. They always have been. When things get bad, when the pressure gets too much, I make a joke. It's not that I don't take things seriously. I take them very seriously, but I've learned that you can be serious without being solemn. You can face the worst that life throws at you and still find something to laugh about. That's how you survive. That's how you keep going." He reached up and touched her face. "I learned that from my mother, Nell. She was the most optimistic person I ever knew, no matter how bad things got. And they got pretty bad when I was growing up with my father's drinking and all the moving around. She always found something to be grateful for. She always believed that tomorrow would be better than today. She taught me that faith isn't just about believing in God. It's about believing in the goodness of life, the possibility of redemption, the hope that things can change." Nancy nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "She would be proud of you today, Ronnie. So proud." Reagan smiled. "I hope so. I hope she's watching from somewhere, seeing that her boy turned out all right. I hope she knows that everything she taught me, everything she believed in, helped me get through today." The next morning, Reagan was visited by James Baker, his chief of staff and other senior advisors. They briefed him on the state of the nation, the reaction to the shooting, the status of the other victims. Press Secretary James Brady had been shot in the head and was in critical condition. Secret Service Agent Timothy McCarthy and Police Officer Thomas Delahanty had also been wounded but were expected to recover. Reagan listened to the briefing, his expression grave. When Baker finished, Reagan asked about the shooter. "His name is John Hinckley, Jr., Baker said. 25 years old, from a wealthy family in Colorado. He apparently did it to impress an actress, Jodie Foster. He was obsessed with her, with that movie she was in, Taxi Driver. He thought shooting you would make her notice him." Reagan was silent for a long moment, processing this information. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost philosophical. "So it wasn't political. It wasn't about my policies or my beliefs or anything I've done. It was just madness. Random madness." Baker nodded. "That's what it looks like, sir." Reagan shook his head slowly. "That's almost harder to accept than if it had been political. If someone had shot me because they disagreed with my views, at least I could understand that. I wouldn't agree with it, but I could understand it. But this is just senseless. A young man throws away his life, nearly takes mine, wounds 3 other people, all because of some fantasy in his head about a movie star." He looked at Baker with an expression of profound sadness. What happens to someone to make them do something like that? What goes wrong in a person's life that they think shooting the president is a reasonable way to get a girl's attention? There must have been signs, warnings, moments when someone could have intervened. How did we miss them? Baker said carefully. "The FBI is investigating, sir. They'll find out everything there is to know about Hinckley." Reagan nodded absently. "I'm sure they will. But I'm not interested in punishment. I'm interested in understanding. I'm interested in making sure this doesn't happen again, to me or to anyone else. We need to do something about mental illness in this country, Jim. We need to do something about the people who fall through the cracks, the ones who are suffering in silence until they explode." He paused, then added quietly, "And I need to forgive him." Baker looked startled. "Forgive him, sir?" Reagan nodded. "Yes. I've been thinking about it all night, and I've decided that I need to forgive John Hinckley. Not because he deserves it. What he did was terrible, and he should face the consequences. But because I can't carry hatred in my heart. I can't spend the rest of my life angry at a disturbed young man who didn't even know me, who shot me because of some delusion that had nothing to do with who I really am." He looked at Baker with quiet conviction. My mother taught me that forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about yourself. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of anger and resentment. If I hate John Hinckley, if I let what he did poison my heart, then he wins. He takes something from me that's more valuable than my life. He takes my peace, my joy, my ability to love. I won't let him do that. I won't give him that power over me. Baker was silent, clearly moved by the president's words. Finally, he said, That's remarkable, sir. I don't know if I could do that." Reagan smiled slightly. "I don't know if I can do it either. Forgiveness isn't a one-time thing. It's a daily choice. I'll have to keep choosing it every day for the rest of my life. But I'm going to try, because that's what my faith demands, and that's what my mother would have wanted, and that's what I need to do to be the person I want to be." Over the following days, as Reagan recovered in the hospital, he continued to display the humor and grace that had characterized his response from the beginning. When he was finally well enough to walk, he insisted on doing so under his own power, refusing a wheelchair. He joked with the nurses, charmed the doctors, and maintained an optimistic demeanor that inspired everyone who saw him. To the surgeons who had saved his life, he said, "I hope you're all good Republicans." When they assured him that they had done their best regardless of politics, he replied, "Well, I guess I owe you one. Send me the bill, I'm good for it." To a nurse who was checking his vital signs, he said, "Does Nancy know about us?" The nurse blushed and laughed, and Reagan winked at her. To his daughter, Maureen, who had rushed to Washington when she heard the news, he said, "I should have known better than to wear a red tie. It made me too easy a target." But beneath the jokes, there was a profound transformation taking place. Reagan had always been a man of faith, but the assassination attempt deepened that faith into something more personal, more urgent. He began to see his survival as a divine mandate, a second chance that came with obligations. In his private diary, which he kept throughout his presidency, Reagan wrote about the shooting and its aftermath with unusual candor. "Getting shot hurts," he wrote. "I never knew how much until today. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the fear I saw in Nancy's eyes when she came to the hospital. I never want to see that look again. I never want to put her through that again." He continued, "I've decided that whatever time I have left now belongs to God. I mean that literally. I believe He saved me for a purpose, and I intend to discover what that purpose is and fulfill it. If it means working for peace with the Soviets, I will do that. If it means standing firm against communism, I will do that too. Whatever He asks of me, I will try to do." And then, in a passage that would not be made public until years after his death, Reagan wrote something that revealed the depth of his transformation. "I have forgiven John Hinckley. I did it this morning in my prayers. I asked God to help me let go of any anger or resentment I might feel toward this young man who tried to kill me. It wasn't easy. Part of me wanted to hate him, wanted to see him punished, wanted him to suffer for what he did. But I know that hatred is a poison that destroys the one who hates, not the one who is hated. So I let it go. I gave it to God. And I feel lighter now, freer, more at peace than I have felt in a long time." He added, "I don't know what will happen to Hinckley. That's for the courts to decide. But whatever happens, I will not be his enemy. I will pray for him, for his healing, for his soul, because that's what my faith requires, and that's who I want to be." 12 days after the shooting, Ronald Reagan walked out of George Washington University Hospital, waving to the cameras, smiling his famous smile, looking for all the world like a man who had just returned from a pleasant vacation rather than a brush with death. The nation watched in amazement and relief, and Reagan's approval ratings soared. But the man who left that hospital was not quite the same man who had entered it. He was still Ronald Reagan, the actor, the politician, the great communicator. He still told jokes and stories, still projected the sunny optimism that had defined his public persona for decades. But there was something else now. Something deeper. Something that would shape the rest of his presidency and his life. He had looked death in the face and found faith. He had been given a second chance and accepted it as a sacred trust. He had forgiven the man who tried to kill him and freed himself from the burden of hatred. In the years that followed, Reagan would negotiate arms reduction treaties with the Soviet Union, would stand at the Berlin Wall and demand that it be torn down, would help bring about the end of the Cold War, without firing a shot. Whether these achievements were the fulfillment of the purpose he believed God had saved him for, only he could say. But on that day in March 1981, lying in a hospital bed with a bullet hole in his chest, Ronald Reagan had discovered something about himself that would carry him through the challenges ahead. He had discovered that he could face the worst that life had to offer and still find something to laugh about. He had discovered that faith was not just a comfort, but a calling. And he had discovered that forgiveness was not weakness, but strength. "I'd like to do this scene again. Starting at the hotel," he had written in those first moments after surgery. But there would be no retakes. There was only the life he had been given, the second chance he had received, and the purpose he was determined to fulfill. The performance of a lifetime had only just begun.